Hello and welcome to the Olive Tree Media webinar series. It's really great to have you joining us. If you're joining us and it's lunchtime, I hope you are really blessed in this lunch break webinar. We are so privileged to have Dan Patterson joining us today. Dan is an apologist, an academic, a lecturer, an author, and he also founded an organization called Questioning Christianity. Now, part of his role with that organization is to go in and out of a lot of different schools, talking to teenagers today about life and faith. So we've brought him in for our live webinar today to share with us some of his insights about the questions that youth are asking today. We've done a couple of webinars and we've explored how faith is sort of opening up and people are becoming more warm to the idea of faith. So is that happening in our teenagers, or what kind of questions are they asking? So if you're a pastor, if you're a parent, a teacher, a mentor, someone invested in the next generation, you are in the right place, because we're going to talk about the questions youth are asking and how we can respond to keep the conversation going. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands that we're joining on. We recognize our Creator God and the stewardship of all these peoples who've looked after this land. And we just acknowledge their stewardship throughout generations. Thank you for joining us. If you're joining us on YouTube, please like and subscribe our channel while you're here. And we'd love you to let us know where you're joining from. So be sure to write in the chat, say a hello. And towards the end, make sure you put a question in. We'll have some time for Q&A with Dan. So if something sparks your interest, just put a Q at the start so we know it's a question, and then just type it into the chat. We'd love to have some interaction, and Karl will throw those questions to Dan Patterson towards the end. So I'd like to welcome Karl, and we're going to get started.
Thank you, Ainsley, and it's fabulous to have you all join us live, or if those of you watching this later on the replay. And before I go to Dan, I just wanted to say that Ainsley has written a book that's called Impress. And in the middle of this webinar today, we're going to actually chat about this. So we're going to give you a little video. It's about impressing faith on your children. It's a fabulous book. It's just been released. In fact, the ink is still wet. So, Ainsley, well done. And we're looking forward to people getting hold of this book and reading it. And if you haven't got a Mother's Day present, here's your option. But thanks, Ainsley. We'll chat about that book later. And right now, we're going to welcome Dan Patterson. Dan, coming to us from sunny Queensland. We're in Sydney, where it's been raining for a week. How's Queensland today, Dan?
Hey, mate, it's great to be joining. Thanks, Karl, and thanks, Ainsley, too. I've just spent a couple of weekends camping, sort of consecutively, and so it's been wet on both occasions as well. I've had a bit of rain, but thankfully the sun's finally come out so we can get through the huge pile of washing that currently fills up our laundry.
Well, I tell you, in the chat, there's somebody that's having a go at us from Sydney, because it's Gwen is from sunny Melbourne. Now, there's a change. Melbourne.
Yeah, I was born in Melbourne, and that's certainly not my recollection of my first 5 years there, but still, well, it's great to have you watching.
Hey, Dan, tell us about how did you get into being an apologist, as just a general question?
Yeah, I'm not sure what I feel about that label specifically, but the task, I think, is really important, of helping to defend and commend the Christian story and the good news of Jesus. I think it happened very naturally for me. I grew up going along to church when I was a youngster, and mum and dad try to pass on the faith as best as they could. They were probably a lot more practical in the way that they loved and served Jesus, and caring for people that were drug affected and running youth drop-in shelters, more so than talking through the dynamics of what to believe and how it all fits together. And I remember when I was young, we went on a family holiday driving from Brisbane back down to sunny Melbourne to visit some relatives over Christmas. And on the way back to Queensland, had a big car accident in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales that left my mum with significant brain damage from headbutting a truck at high speed.
Wow.
And so that was sort of one of those life-shattering experiences. That was a defining moment for our family. And my mum survived, but much changed in those years afterwards. And so it kind of raised challenges for how do I really believe that God's loving and that he cares, and that this is something worth holding on to. And so for most of my teenage years, I largely hit the back door of the church and wasn't forced to go along, never went to youth group really, or didn't get involved in any of the Christian activities, went to a state school with almost entirely secular mates or people from different faith backgrounds. And so my journey into talking about the reasons for belief and wrestling with questions actually started with me having those very same doubts and barriers to belief. And it was in my first couple of years out of school that I ended up coming to faith in Jesus through reading the Gospels and through the witness of a friend or two. And then came to church and was encouraged by my youth pastor. It's okay to ask these questions. It's okay to have these doubts, and that there are significant resources from different Christian thinkers who have wrestled with them over the years that you can bring to bear in trying to search for meaningful answers. And so that was my own experience for a couple of years.
It's great. It's very encouraging for everyone to hear that story, Dan, because this has not been a kind of intellectual exercise on your behalf. It's been a personal response to tragedy and difficulty and challenge. So it's so good to hear that. And we respect you for going through that incredibly difficult time. You go into schools, and that's exactly where we want to leap to now. You're going into schools. What's the response like as you, there's a much broader questions, and we'll get to very specifics, but as you turn up to schools at the moment, is it, oh no, here's the religious guy? Is it, oh great, I've got an opportunity to answer some questions or ask some questions? What's the response as you turn up?
It's a mixed bag, as probably the parents and the teachers expect. It's a mixed bag depending on the culture of the school. And I predominantly get to go into church background schools. Here in Queensland, obviously, we've got state schools and private schools. Most of the private or independent schools are run by either old church denominations. So they started out with a strong Christian ethos and mission, but have somewhat lost that vision and just retained some of the Christian ethics maybe associated with it. And then some Christian schools, which genuinely still retain a disciple-making desire in how they go about educating for eternity. And so it's a mixed bag even within those, about the year level that you get, the cohort, the time of the day when I arrive, whether they've had food or haven't had food, whether it's hot or raining. It's always a really different mixed bag. And my general, I think, reflection would be that often they are very disconnected until you're able to connect them, until you're able to show that maybe you've got something to offer here. And I normally, in most of the school engagements, do like a 20-minute talk and then maybe 25 minutes of Q&A or something like that. It's the talk that primes the pump, and then the way that you answer the first or second questions that actually opens them up, and they get a bit more to the edge of their seat as to whether or not they're going to lean in and ask their doubts and questions as well.
Now, we're going to get to those questions. I just want to talk about that. Say there are people here from all over the place, Western Australia, as well, Perth, Tuggeranong, and just keep putting your notes, Western Sydney. Great to have you here. And as Ainsley said in the beginning, if you've got a question you want to ask, and we get the time, just put a Q before it, and we're going to ask those. So jump in the chat. It's great to have all you guys. Hi from Launceston, fabulous sunny Adelaide. There you go. There's even Adelaide people are now giving us a hard time for our weather. Dan, the whole concept of this webinar today was, so what are the questions the next generation are asking, and how do we respond? But let me just ask you, we did a webinar a while ago with Justin Briley, and I know you know Justin. I think you've chatted with Justin. Brilliant guy, great mind. And he's written a book where he actually sort of says what happened to the new atheists. And it's part of this whole notion of, have they gone completely? Because they were a big deal in, say, about 2010 to 2013, and they've just disappeared. So is that a finished question, or is that or the kind of the whole atheistic question still out there?
I think the brash atheist, there's not a whole lot of stomach for them, culturally speaking, even amongst secular people. They would want to distance themselves from an aggressive or angry version of atheism. I do think a lot of the critiques that they raised, though, still have cultural currency and aren't as pointed as they were articulated by people like Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris, but they're part of the mood now that people share when it comes to Christianity, almost like that still bubbling assumption that there's something about what we've discovered through science that seems to be at odds with any religious perspective on the world. And when you look at the growing number of religious nuns in Australia, it was 49% of them said that their main reason for rejecting Christianity was that they prefer a science or evidence-based approach to forming their beliefs. That's still a pervading kind of criticism or doubt that bubbles somewhat hidden underneath people's cultural feelings. I think there's a wariness of religious belief, particularly a wariness more of the morality of God in the Bible itself, that was brought on by people like Dawkins and his whole line of the God of the Old Testament being the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. And so I know a lot of the popular skepticism now has to do with, well, what about slavery in the Bible, or the treatment of outsiders or minorities within Christian history? How do we make sense of God who seems to support violence or even genocidal commands in the Canaanite conquest? These are bigger questions now than they were 20 years ago. And I think they're still holding a lot of sway over people's minds as to, can I trust that Christianity is good for me, irrespective of the truth question? Can I trust that this is really something worth looking into myself?
Yeah, and without diverting down a side path, there's some interesting developments internationally. I mean, I guess many of the people joining us today on the webinar might have caught up with the news that Russell Brand just got baptized in the River Thames in London in the last 2 days, and Bear Grylls baptized him. And it's now there's a whole bunch of reactions on social media about we shouldn't glorify just because they're a celebrity. Let's be careful but what's happening in the future. But there is an interesting phenomenon out there, Dan, with some of these thinkers, writers, academics.
Yeah, I mean, I think people have been interviewing Justin because his podcast and book with the same title of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God maybe felt premature when he released it. But the last few months have really maybe brought home part of his thesis that maybe the tides of faith, they've been going out with the growth of secularism for a long time, but are they starting to come back in? I've been speaking about Christian faith for a long time as though our culture is a prodigal culture, that it received the inheritance from the Father's house, the Judeo-Christian heritage, and now it's squandering that inheritance on secular shores. And I think what you're seeing is a lot of public intellectuals who may be concerned about cultural developments and different belief systems that are rushing into the secular void. They're looking back and thinking, well, have we lost something? Are they waking up to the point of recognizing, man, there was meaning and there was hope and there was a certain kind of moral caliber that came with the Christian story that we don't have the resources to furnish with a secular story. And so they're starting to consider maybe there's something more here and looking into it. And some of the responses I even cataloged a couple of days ago just on a social media post, but people like Tammy Peterson, Jordan Peterson's wife, and people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, which was one of the female front runners when it came to the new atheist kind of movement, left a very aggressive form of Islam, but has just announced her faith in Jesus and defended it under interview by Richard Dawkins publicly. And so there's definitely something happening. And don't rejoice just because celebrities are turning and trusting in Jesus, but we should rejoice when sinners turn and trust in Jesus, and we should hope and pray for the outcome of their faith, that it would bear much fruit. But it is an interesting cultural phenomenon. People are taking the Christian faith more seriously now than they would have 5 years ago, and in public it's getting more of a hearing than it would have 5 years ago, and I find that interesting.
And as we get into these questions, I mean, one of the things for everyone joining us to be encouraged by is that there's good news. There's actually a move. So you go to schools. One of the things we wanted to ask you is, what are the top 5 questions that you get asked?
I used to be able to answer that question easily because it used to be something about science, something about scripture, something about suffering, something about sexuality. And I still think all of those questions are there. But one of the things that has really struck me in the last 18 months or 2 years, and we would do maybe 80 schools talks a year. And so face down close to 1,000 questions a year. Is how diverse those questions are, and how much it really is young people just trying to wrestle with the Christian story as a whole. How do I make sense of certain events? How do I make sense of certain implications of if this doctrine or belief were true? Where does this fit with the goodness of God? There's a much bigger intellectual and pastoral tone to it than simply the stock criticisms or concerns. And that isn't to say that they're not there. A suffering question inevitably comes up. A question about God's fairness and judgment inevitably comes up. A question around why God doesn't make himself more obvious or more felt as a reality to everyone around the world always comes up. But these other ones are bubbling away in more diverse ways. And I think it's maybe a reflection on the fact that they are wrestling with Christianity in a new way, trying to make sense of it, but they are largely biblically illiterate. So even though these would be faith-based schools, I think I only do a couple of state school talks a year and more like intro to philosophy or sharing your own personal story. Most of these students from these schools still have grown up in faithless environments without a religious upbringing, and even Christian kids haven't necessarily been well discipled in the Christian story, and so they are very fresh when it comes to biblical literacy, and they are just trying to make sense of, what does it mean? If it were true, how does that affect my life? Where's the relevance levels? And I'd say that the biggest challenge in schools is overcoming that degree of apathy, of recognizing what does belief in God actually mean for me? How is it relevant to my life?
Is there, in the last 10 years, say, are there questions that have come up? Maybe let me rephrase that. In the last couple of years, are there questions that have come up that are a bit out of left field that surprised you?
Well, the ones that have faded that have surprised me, if I could start there. 3 or 4 years ago, I was always having to answer questions around gender identity. That is a rare question that I've gotten in the last 2
Really?
years. And
Wow.
so as much as that has exploded as a cultural question from sort of 2015 onwards, the last couple of years, I feel like a bit of a turn in the tide on that as well. It just doesn't seem to be occupying as many students' minds. And what I particularly notice is those that are tend to be elite city schools. So there's particular cultural centers where that plays a much bigger kind of note. I think the questions that have surprised me have been the ones that show how connected young people are with the online narratives. We try and keep abreast of what are the algorithms saying to different people in different age groups across social media, particularly on TikTok and Instagram, because they're probably the two primary points of engagement for sort of 15 to 24-year-olds, but also through YouTube, which is our probably prominent place of being on there with the YouTube channel with our ministry. And one of the things I'm definitely noticing there is people are asking specific questions about conversations that are raised on things like the Joe Rogan podcast, something that Jordan Peterson said. And so they're wrestling with particular cultural thinkers from various perspectives and saying, what do you think about this? What do you make of that argument or that idea? And so it's been a wake-up call to me that young people are wrestling with these ideas, but not necessarily doing it in person with teachers or parents or mentor figures, but that they're often having these conversations online, which is what a lot of the research is bearing out.
It sounds, I mean, a lot of people could assume from this discussion that you're going in, you've got 1,000 questions a year. You've got some people that must be probably a bit aggressive in the way they chat to you. And there are tough questions that are difficult to answer. We're going to get to some of those. But tell me about posture, because surely how you answer the question is kind of as important as having a cracking answer that no one can respond to.
Yeah, I think particularly if the driving concern behind some of the criticism of Christianity is the way in which minorities have felt treated in the past, the invective with which those questions can be driven from compassion or concern for people that this question particularly loves, or for the way that they've been treated in the past. And so if I'm able to, rather than respond with the same temperature that the question was asked at, if I can somewhat just absorb whatever harsh words or tone comes and respond ironically and try and just to reason through it and give ground wherever I can, I found that does a lot to soften the next level question. Because I'll often ask for a follow-up. Does that help? Or has that made any sense to you? Or do you have anything you want to say in response to that? Actually allowing them to speak and have somewhat of a voice. A lot of that can matter a lot. I mean, it's the Apostle Paul who says that always let your conversation be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. And the Apostle Peter in his command on public Christianity to do this with gentleness and respect, when we always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks. I think we've just really tried to embody that, and it does often make a difference. That's not going to be a catch-all. Sometimes people will just be hurt and angry or see Christianity as the enemy, but I've found that significantly lessens the force. I remember one specific example, probably 3 years ago, there was a particularly difficult year 12 cohort that went through an elite private school, girls' school here in Brisbane. And I was warned by the chaplain, who's a dear friend. She said, look, this is going to be a tricky one, as I was presenting on the question of why would a good God let bad things happen? Gave the talk, first question, and it was a question on sexuality and gender identity. And it was one that was asked with a lot of condemning force. And just took a little bit of time to unpack that and to live out those steps that I just talked about. And it was amazing just to see the shift when this young woman saw, oh, he's actually taking me seriously. He's not looking for a gotcha moment. He's not trying to be defensive, but he's just willing to hear and then recognize some of the concern and then see if the Christian story has any resources to respond. And her posture shifted in response to that. And so where we can to take that kind of grace response, I think can just do a lot of the work of our communication of the faith.
Yeah. Let me just jump into a question where with Jean has asked a question about with people going online and the online space for their questions, what implications does that have for traditional, and she uses the word embodied models of youth ministry?
Yeah, look, I think it's going to have to be supplementary. I don't think the online stuff is ever going to replace the importance of healthy models of life. And one of the great dangers of us exporting our discipleship to online sources and to key celebrity Christians has been that often their answers come up short and often their lives are exposed as having a whole nother element to them. You just can't do that shepherding from afar. And so I think embodied youth ministry is incredibly important, but I think we're fooling ourselves if we're not also trying to help drip feed the truth into the social media diet that our young people are watching, because they are. As much as we can follow the advice of people like Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book called The Anxious Generation, just to reduce the amount of influence that social media has over young people, particularly in their early teenage years. I do think it's like, how do we shepherd them towards helpful online voices, recognizing that every criticism under the sun is going to be shared by either comedic voices, high-profile intellects, or ex-Christians who are going to have stinging critiques of Christianity. And if we're not equipping people to know what they believe and why, and giving them good online resources to look for answers when you can't be there in person, then I do think we're selling them short on the needs that are out there for this generation.
What about, have you seen an openness to the Christian narrative? This is another Les Murdy Baptist Church, when it's unpacked in a helpful way. So you've got an aggressive question. If you respond in a way that's helpful, do you see an openness to the Christian message and narrative?
Very much, very much. So we talk about in our speaker academy, where we're trying to train other Christians for doing public Christianity. We speak about 3 elements of how you could respond in an answer: to explain, to argue, and to invite. And it may be that one of those takes the lead, or you can fit all 3 into a response. But so much of what people have in their mind about what Christianity is a misconception. It's some kind of caricature that's been painted either by a poor representation in their upbringing or by the way that it's communicated by either Christian messengers, but usually by Christian critics. And often replacing that with the real thing. Actually, what does the Christian story say on this? So what resources does it have to make sense of suffering? Does the Bible speak about the raw nature of our experiences? Does it give language of lament? Does it raise space for doubt and confusion? But why would a God allow some of these bad things to happen? Are there real reasons for perhaps doing so? I found that goes a long way, particularly when we're actually answering the positive questions of what young people are searching for. What does the Christian story say about the value of who you are and your true identity? What does it say about whether our lives have purpose and how we can find real meaning? What does it say about whether there's hope that can animate us through not just pie in the sky when you die, but the kind of hope that shapes how we live here and now and what we live for? And that does, I think people resonate with that. Is there wisdom that we can get on how to navigate life? Young people are really, really, I think, open to receiving those kinds of messages. And I have scores of people come up after every talk or Q&A and just say, hey, thank you. That was actually a lot more helpful than I was expecting, or this wasn't the session that I was worried it was going to be.
It's always good to start a session with low expectations, Dan.
Yeah. It's actually one of the things that kind of I struggle when it comes to introductions. A lot of people, when they introduce you to do a guest talk, will try and read out a litany of things that you may have done. And I'm like, can my wife just introduce me for a second so that you get an honest representation? It's like a movie. Go in with low expectations and then you'll be positively surprised rather than the other way around.
Listen, I was going to say, one of the things that we wanted to do was actually give some responses. So the question that was a huge issue for you, and look, there's been books, tomes written on this question, but that issue for you about where's God when it hurts, why does God allow suffering? What are some of the key ideas you give in response to that question?
I think there's a few ways you can go about it. One is just to question whether getting rid of God makes any more sense of our experience of the brokenness of the world. I look back at the experience we had with the car accident and the aftermath of my family having to wrestle with mum's new disabilities, and it was just a mess. And there's something that felt profoundly wrong about that whole thing to me. But that intuition that suffering is wrong, or that evil really is evil, and we should call it by that name, those are intuitions that make sense in a world that was created for good but's become damaged by evil in the Christian story. But that's intuitions that don't make a whole lot of sense at all in a purely secular story where naturalism is kind of the underwriting text. where there is at bottom no evil, no good, no design, no purpose, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. That kind of amoral universe doesn't make sense of our deepest intuitions around suffering and evil. And that actually gives people pause. Get rid of God, sure. The old Epicurus challenge, problem of evil, goes away, but you bump into that new challenge. How do you explain the wrongness of suffering and the evilness of evil? And so the fact of saying to someone, hey, get rid of God, sure. Maybe you don't have this particular intellectual problem anymore, but you don't get any answers. You don't get any hope. You don't get any help. You've just taken away the resources and hope of the Christian story. And that gets people pause. And then you can look at, well, what answers does the Christian story give as to why God may choose to create a world like this, one at least with the potential for things to go wrong? And that classic free will defense, articulated first seemingly by Augustine and then particularly articulated by Alvin Plantinga, it goes a long way. God wanted to create a meaningful universe with agents who are capable of affecting this world, of having an influence, of doing meaningful things that are either morally praiseworthy or blameworthy. But particularly, God wanted us to experience love. Deep and meaningful relationships are part of the purpose of our existence, to love God and love others. And if you remove meaningful agency, the ability to say no to God's wisdom rather than to just blindly follow every command like a robot, then you largely, it's hard to see how you hold on to that kind of meaning in those kind of relationships. I think that explanation from Genesis, that God creates the world with a moral fabric, gives us meaningful agency, but then allows us to make our own decisions and to go against God's good design. When we run our hand against the moral grain of his universe, we get splinters. And that's kind of what's happened. But then ultimately to talk, I think the big one though, Karl, is just that, can you trust God?
Yes.
And that's really where the Jesus stuff comes in, because Job as a story, it raises the idea that we can't know all of God's reasons because we don't see all that God sees. We don't know all that God knows, but we know enough to know that even in the darkness and the doubt, we can trust him because he was willing to suffer for us at the cross. And it's that famous God with scars picture that convinced Dostoevsky that has been so compelling for me, that we worship a God who knows our suffering, who's with us, who would prefer to suffer for us than for us to be left alone in that darkness.
Yeah, Joanne has said he loves your comments about drip feed into the social media diet. She'd said, I'd love to hear more about ways you can do this in a way that would be well received by teens. Open the TikTok and learn how to rap. I mean,
yeah, no.
And
I don't think what that means is every youth minister should do it, because it actually is a really difficult world to get into and to gain any kind of traction in. What my encouragement would be find good, credible voices that are already connecting with young people that do it. And they may not agree with everything that you agree with. And I think this is part of the challenge in this environment of recognizing, hey, what we're trying to do is create wise young people who are developing in their understanding of God. It's okay to expose them to different influences who may not agree with every aspect of your theology or your particular ministry philosophy, but who can at least offer a range of answers that students then can draw from. And so I'd find people on TikTok that are doing this really well. Some names may be more familiar to you, people like Sean McDowell, the son of Josh McDowell, who's gained quite a strong TikTok following, or some newer voices, people like Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy, who has a huge TikTok following from teenagers and from young adults, but does a great job of very sarcastically dealing with a lot of the online objections by creating response videos to a lot of these key criticisms of Christianity. And so it may not be your style, it may not be your approach, but you can at least suggest, say, hey, remember that question you asked? I found this cool video. You should follow that guy. And it's not enforcing anything on them. It's just giving them some recommendations. And if they watch it once, guess what? That triggers the algorithm to bring up similar people in similar fields who are going to be producing similar kinds of content. We're on there ourselves if you're looking for stuff, just doing 1-minute answers to the questions that people send into our website. So we're trying to faithfully represent Jesus in that sort of arena.
What rules now? There's anybody that's been on social media knows that you'll always be attacked, and it's not always the most gracious responses that people give. What rules do you give yourself on social media, Dan, about how you respond?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually had a mate call me yesterday. He started a podcast on mental health and ministry a few months back, and it was going really well. And in the last month, he's like, man, I've just got hit by this wave of negative criticism. What do? I figured you might have some thoughts in this area. And so I just shared with him a bunch of things. I actually posted it on my Facebook account if you want to go and track that down. I think there's 7 things on there, but a few things that we do here as our QC team. If we get repeat critics, we make sure that they go on our weekly prayer list. So for our team meeting each week where we read scripture and pray together and talk over the week, we pray regularly for our common voices and who are always throwing out sort of negative trolling comments. Which has been really helpful for our own hearts. I mean, we all get tempted towards negativity in response to that or getting dragged down, but man, nothing changes your view of that person than praying God's will for their life. We make sure that if we are feeling the effects of negative comments, that we take a bit of time to consider why. I mean, randoms on the internet should not have that much power over your world. So it's probably a good red flag that something in your emotional or psychological spiritual tank needs some attention. We definitely make sure we pause before posting anything in response. So I just ask those grid questions. Is this helpful? Is this godly? Is this wise? Is this something that we think God would affirm as a response? And always try and respond with the same grace with which we've been shown in the gospel, where the Lord Jesus himself, though reviled, didn't throw that back in response, but absorbed evil in love. So there've been some really clarifying few things, but you can track down more across our social media stuff.
Fabulous. We're going to come back and give Dan a break for 5 minutes and just remind you in a short video about the release of the book Impress, what it's about, where you can get it. So here's a video just for 3 minutes about the book Impress.
In Deuteronomy chapter 6, Moses is speaking to a new generation. And it said that he says to the people, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments today are to be on your hearts. Impress them upon your children. I've written this book, Impress, jumping out of this very verse, this ancient words of Moses to a new generation. And this book is an encouragement to the new generation of parents, those like me who are parenting today, who are juggling the desire to be impressive, but also want to hold the encouragement to impress faith on our kids. This book is in 2 parts. Part 1 is the why we should prioritize and focus on passing on faith to our kids. And the second part is how. How can we do this in our modern and busy families? Studies and articles continually show that the simple act of sitting around our table is growing and shaping our kids in far more ways than we could imagine. Provided the TV is off, technology is away, and everyone gives their loving attention to those at the table, this time is a little haven for our kids and all of us who spend our day fighting the pressures of the frenetic pace of life. One of the chapters in my new book, Impress, is about the importance of the dinner table as one of the places where we can actually impart and impress faith on our kids. There's some simple practices and some ideas that you can participate in around the table, but it's a wonderful place and time that we can have with our kids, where we can slow down the pace of life, we can connect with them, we can find out about their day, and we can open up conversations that are deep and conversations about life and faith. So if you're a person of faith and you want to work out how today we can talk about and live our faith in a way that makes an impression on the next generation, then can I encourage you to buy Impress, Why the Hard and Holy Work of Passing on Faith to Our Kids is of first importance and how we can do it better.
So our team at Olive Tree Media are so pleased to be releasing Impress. As we said, timed well for Mother's Day. If you haven't done it yet, make sure you get your copy, Impress, Passing on Faith to Your Children. Don't worry about being impressive. Try and impress faith. Dan, we've chatted before about the idea of dinosaurs, but there's actually a question here from Margaret, who said, are questions about UFOs, alien life in the universe, on your radar? Pun intended. So we'll come back to dinosaurs, but what about UFOs? Because there's a lot of discussion out there at the moment. And how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, we did a video somewhat begrudgingly on this on our channel, and we do a bunch of different content. One of our mainstays, though, is sort of these 5 to 10 minute responses to big questions that just keep coming up, that we try and offer substantive answers, but in a very accessible format. And we did one on, does alien life pose a problem for Christianity, and what do we believe about UFOs? Simply because it does come up quite a bit, particularly with the release over the last couple of years of a range of footage and reports and files from American military sources that just show these unexplained aerial phenomenon, or UAPs, they now call them, rather than UFOs. So you can check that out. In short, I don't think it's a big problem for us whatsoever. I think God is big enough to create more than just human life. We have other sentient beings in creation known as angels already. So if it were to be discovered, as unlikely as I think that is, it's not ultimately a problem for Christianity.
Ah, so they're angels in ships.
Well, that's one of the potential thoughts, is that Christians have argued in the past, some have, that they would be demons trying to deceive us about the naturalistic origins of our universe.
Let's go the other
But
direction.
I don't think that's necessary.
Let's go the other direction. What about dinosaurs? Because
Well, they're probably not
comes up.
considered to be demons, if that's what you're asking. Yeah, and this actually would be a great example of one of the ways in which we at Questioning Christianity really have tried to argue for the faith, is by offering a mere Christianity in response. Now, our speakers, our team, have alternative views, have certain kinds of convictions on a whole range of secondary questions when it comes to Christianity. But what we try and do is actually present the options to students. We say, look, Christians who love Jesus and love the Bible, they don't all agree either on how to interpret the early chapters of Genesis as ancient literature, or how to make sense of the fossil record or the history of our universe as discovered through science, which means there are a range of options which you get to wrestle with to arrive at your own theological conscience. And so we'll say, well, young earthers will interpret the book of Genesis to say that dinosaurs were created on day 5 and 6, depending on whether they inhabit the sea, the sky, or the land, that they were created right alongside the first humans, that Adam and Eve could have ridden a stegosaurus in the Garden of Eden, although it probably inhabited a different part of the planet, and that most of dinosaur life was wiped out at Noah's flood a couple of thousand years before Jesus, roughly about 2600 BC. That's one way of making sense of it. They point to places like Job 40 and say it's in the Bible. You've got Behemoth and Leviathan. Surely that's dinosaurs. But other old Earth interpretations and evolutionary creationist interpretations would want to put dinosaurs back at a different part of Earth's sort of timeline in the Mesozoic era. So they say, look, here's a couple of different options. Here's why they get there. And as a Christian, you can believe the Bible, you can believe in Jesus, and you can wrestle with the best way to interpret Scripture and science in order to come up with a faithful conscience.
There's a Craig and Janelle. Our students seem to have many questions about heaven and hell, perhaps coming from a societal perception that Christianity involves ultimately making a choice between the two. What are your thoughts, responses there?
Definitely. I think these are huge questions. They probably have less questions around heaven than they do about hell, because heaven seems to raise just curiosities. So what's it going to be like? Am I going to have to sing like church the whole time? Is it disembodied? How am I meant to make sense of that? But hell raises particular questions around the goodness of God. For them, there's questions around, is God fair in how he has distributed light in knowledge of the gospel? What happens to people who die without Jesus? What happens to people who believe in other religions? What happens to people who grew up in an abusive religious background and ended up rejecting the faith because of all of the harm that came to them with that sort of institutional cover of the church? Just all of those sort of questions it raises, and then just the proportional nature of hell. Is it just that people would suffer for an eternity of conscious torment for a short or finite life of sin? And then just questions around what is hell like? And I think there's a huge Christian conversation around the nature of hell that's both ongoing and needs to be had clearly. It's one that I've changed my mind on theologically over the years. I did my master's thesis on that topic, but I think it's just one that we need to have healthy conversations around, because most of their imaginations are shaped by what they see in movies and medieval literature and stuff that have sort of come into our popular consciousness, rather than from wrestling with what does the Bible actually say about the final fate of those who are lost. So I do think, a ton of questions that we get around judgment and hell.
Let me just say good on Nick Hood, who answered Janelle's question about who was the second bloke after Sean McDowell, and it's Michael Jones. So Nick Hood's doing our job for us. So
Good on you,
well
mate.
done. Now, listen, one of the issues that seems to come up a lot, and it's about the whole question of religion in general, as in, is religion good for us? And then the notion that more specifically, because this was sort of Christopher Hitchens' thing, religion poisons everything. What's your response there? I mean, how is that playing out in the next generation coming through? Do they still have this notion that religion in general, Christianity specific, is actually a negative force within our community, and that's why they think it's actually better to get rid of it? What's that? Does that question come up? How do you respond to it?
Yeah, I haven't seen that much. I think there's maybe particular sporadic concerns, particularly around the conflict in the Middle East right now. And what does Christianity say about that? I think around minorities to do with sexuality and gender. But outside of those couple of examples, I'm not convinced at all that the younger generation has imbibed that religion is bad for you perspective. I would say a lot of them are indifferent to it. Maybe some of them even see the folly of the strong cultural opposition towards the goodness of Christianity in the past and recognize, no, maybe there's some wisdom there. Maybe it promotes some values that are helpful. That probably would be better descriptive of what I'm picking up through the questions and comments.
Well, what you kind of hinted at this around the question of heaven and hell. You said before that one of the questions that comes up quite often is the question of judgment. Is God a judgmental God? Is God judging us? How do you respond to those issues?
Yeah, I think this is actually where we're on the front foot with the current generation, in that the heightened conscience towards the pursuit of justice in a whole realm of earthly pursuits. So when it comes to care about equality and about people around the world and concerns around oppression, and a lot of these narratives actually serve an opportunity for presenting the gospel on this front, because people do care about justice. And in the past, I think the idea of justice was largely painted in a negative light of the heaven-hell judgment conversation. Whereas now people are saying, no, we do want someone to set things right. We're trying to set things right. And I think this is an opportunity, like we shared before, about the Christian story. Does it have something meaningful to offer? Are people open and receptive to it when you say that, no, God's judgment is about him fulfilling his promise to deal with evil? That we all cry out for justice. We long for evil to be brought to an end. The only problem is whether or not that evil has wrapped itself up within us. And this is kind of the Christian narrative in the gospel, is that God comes to deal with evil first in Jesus, in the human heart, by suffering and dying for sin so that we can be forgiven and made a new creation. So that when he comes again to deal with all evil right around the world, to exile it from God's future world, that means he doesn't have to exile or end us as well. And so I think that framing of judgment, of it's God coming to deal with evil, people are a lot more open to that concept. It's just where you've got to be careful around relating, all right, what does it mean though that we're wrapped up with that problem itself?
Yeah, interesting. I years ago, in one of our series, we interviewed a guy called James Orr. Since that interview, because of us, but he's become quite famous. He's done a very long podcast with Jordan Peterson, and I listened to him being interviewed a little bit after that, and he did this very interesting thing. It's about what you were saying about evil and judgment. That he said we've replaced sin with syndrome. That we now have a kind of therapeutic society. How do you find interaction around the concept of sin? Are we just kind of making it a syndrome, a symptom of a problem that we can fix with medication or with counseling?
I think there are certainly elements of the Christian story that would lean in that direction. So you think of all the broad metaphors for sin and what it does. I mean, there's a corrupting influence, but there is also a conscious moral responsibility. And I think we can't divorce one from the other and only preach one part of the biblical story. Certainly sin is like a cancer that infects all of us, and therefore we experience the fallenness of the world, our disordered desires, things over which initially we don't have a whole lot of control, but what we choose to do in light of those desires whether we choose to reorient them in a love for God, whether we choose to bring them into alignment with God's good design, we are morally responsible for those sorts of things. There is a real guilt that's associated with that. And so I think we can't divorce what the Christian story would want us to hold together, which is why the good news of the gospel isn't just that we become a new creation and receive a new heart and new desires that are written on them, but that also that we need the forgiveness of sins, and that Christ's death, his atonement on the cross, and his resurrection to life offers us both sides of that coin.
Yeah. There's a question here about spirituality and, kids being into spiritual stuff and open to spirituality, which includes Jesus, but reject the gospel. And I want to just make a comment because we're filming a new series at the moment, Dan. It's called Encounter. And last week we were interviewing a lady in the US, and she told about her personal story that at the age of 5, her mum introduced her to a Ouija board. She just sort of followed that trend into that whole spiritualist realm, eventually being described by some other people as a white witch. So spirituality was a really huge part of her life, but faith and Christianity weren't. Do you see that there's this spiritual discussion and pursuit without the person of Jesus being in that mix?
I think we get questions around the exclusivity of Christianity, not just the whole why is there only one way to believe, but it's what is it specifically that Jesus brings to the table when it comes to understanding the nature of spiritual reality. I wouldn't say I see a ton of students here, and this could again just be a location thing. I'm predominantly dealing Southeast Queensland versus inner city in Sydney, so there may just be some cultural differences I probably couldn't speak to that'd be more prevalent in different parts of Australia. But I don't see a ton of students pursuing spiritual practices. I think you see things come and go in trends, so it probably depends on when they're living, what becomes popular on TikTok, what people try as they do their sleepovers, but not a whole lot of sustained pursuit of spirituality in the abstract.
What about when you don't know the answer? Now, Dan, this is your whole area. You're doing it all the time in schools. Most of us, and most of those on this webinar, are probably gently falling to their knees and pray they're never asked these questions.
Yeah.
What do you do when somebody asks you a question? Your only response is, "That's a great question."
Yeah, I think that's totally fine. There should be an expectation of ignorance in a whole lot of areas. In fact, if we go into conversations thinking we know the answers, it's probably just not grappling with our true human condition. And I think there's something deeply refreshing about someone who says, that's a great question. Actually, I haven't thought about that before, or I'm not an expert, which is why I caveat every Q&A that I do by saying, hey, I actually in these areas try and be a little bit more like a GP. I try to know a tiny bit about a bunch of things, but mostly I try and know where I should send you when you need a specialist. So if you ask me questions where I have no idea, I'm just trying to figure out, all right, where can I send this person? It's a YouTube channel or a book or a website or just someone that they can ask this question to that's going to give them a way better answer than I can. One of the most dangerous things I've seen is where people have asked teachers or pastors or people in some kind of spiritual authority in their life a question, and that person has fudged an answer when they had no idea what to say, that has ended up undermining that person's sense of the credibility of Christianity, because it's gone on. They have a pretty attuned meter when it comes to figuring out, is this person telling me the truth, or are they just pulling it out of some other part of their body? And so I think the best thing we can say is, that's a great question. I really don't know. I haven't thought about that. Can I go away and find out something? And maybe I'll send you a video or an article or something like that, or we can chat about it next time I see you. That actually communicates that you're taking their questions seriously, that you care about them enough to go out of your way to look for a response, and that Christians ourselves are on a journey of learning, that part of loving God with our minds and loving our neighbor as ourself means we're constantly learning and growing and developing in our concept of who God is and how we respond to the kind of questions and doubts that are out there. So don't make it up. Show the humility, own up to it, say, look, I don't know, but I'll go and figure it out and we can chat about it next time. How does that sound?
There's somebody just bounced back on that whole question of sin. I want to give an answer, and I'll get you to have a think about it as well. Where people is basically saying that it's sins. They're saying that Sarah, that sin's only spoken about in Christian circles, and people don't use the word sin. I mean, how do we look at the concept of sin if that concept's not talked? As you think about
Great idea. That's a really good idea. We speak about. Oh, you go.
Okay, so I read a book recently that I wouldn't actually recommend the book because it has really bad language in it, and I'm not going to use the bad. Yeah.
I knew exactly where you're going with that one, mate.
Francis Spuford. I read this book, and it's just, he actually has this wonderful concept of sin where now he uses a different word that I'm going to use, but it's the human potential to mess things up. He has an acronym, and the whole way through the book, he uses this acronym, which was actually his own faith journey when he discovered grace in his human potential to mess things up. And and I found it a really interesting way of explaining sin, because it's not this religious term out there in the world, but we all recognize our ability to mess things up. And yeah, anyway, your comments on that?
Yeah, I think that's maybe framed in the negative, and I certainly appreciate his line was the propensity, and so it's like, man, everything we touch just seems to end up disordered. But the one that I appreciate is in Scripture, where even in Romans, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's something of a definition of what it means to sin in that particular use of the language. So I just talk about, hey, we are not who we are created to be. We're not living up to who we're made to be, which is such an incredible thing, because for young people who are already struggling in a meaning crisis and are wondering if there's anything worth about them, and then you say you were created to be something remarkable and you are loved by God even when you stuff up. But yet we all know that none of us are who we're meant to be, because none of us even live up to our own conscience on what we think is right, let alone the standard that God gives for us. And so that's a really helpful way that I talk about sin. It's not particular commands that have been broken or some sacred boundary that's been transgressed. I think people in our culture borrow language from that all the time. Our laws certainly do. But I think that idea of, hey, we're not who we should be. And particularly when you sub in then Jesus as the example, who shows us what it means to love God and neighbor, and how far I fall short compared to him, how much I don't live up to that model. This is one of the reasons of why we both need that example, but also need the forgiveness and help to become again who we're meant to be. And that's a work of God's Spirit.
And it's interesting what you're saying there, because I think it says something about how we should approach the gospel, whether it's with teenagers or, people who are retired, which is we've tended in evangelical world to start with brokenness and sin. But what you're saying is, how about starting with potential creation, what we were meant to be? That's almost a positive way of looking at that question.
Because you've got a culture that's raised on the secular story, and I use that, I know that's a loose term, it's just my catch-all way of referring to kind of like a scientific naturalism or a vacuum of answers to life's deepest questions, which largely speaking will say to young people, look, you're a cosmic accident and there's no ultimate meaning to your life. And so rather than starting with Genesis 3, and this is Sam Albury's language, my mate, he goes, we need to start our gospel presentation again with Genesis 1, that you were created in the image of God for deep and meaningful relationship, a creature of inestimable worth, but you've also become damaged by evil. And so it's that great diagnosis that's recognized by Blaise Pascal and by Dostoevsky and everyone else along the line of it's the light and the dark, it's the good and the evil that are now mixed into our human experience of the world. And our shadow side is what the Christian story diagnoses. It says we all have a terminal condition, it's called sin, and we need a savior from it, the only one who promises eternal life. And so, I think it's important that we start with Genesis 1 in that regard and not just with Genesis 3.
So everybody listening and with us now live, and we really appreciate everybody who's with us, appreciate your comments, and thanks all over the place, all over the country, even in New Zealand. Most people would be asking themselves, so where do we go, Dan? Now, clearly, questioningchristianity.com is the place to go for a whole bunch of short answers, or even to link people to it. So tell people about that, and I've got a follow-up question.
Yeah, sure. So most of what we do is on YouTube. So if you look at QC Socials, or just look up Questioning Christianity, you'll see my ugly mug on most of the thumbnails. That's a whole science in itself. But that's where we're putting out content right across different social media channels, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. At QC Socials is our tag. So just check that out on Twitter as well. But yeah, our website's a good anchor point if you're wanting to figure out more, and also to look at a book. I wrote a book with a friend of mine called Rian, called Questioning Christianity, same title, Is There More to the Story, is the subtitle. And the whole heartbeat there was to represent the Christian faith for a generation who's been raised to think that maybe religion isn't worth taking seriously or have a bad taste in their mouth from their upbringing. And so we try and lead with a good gospel, that the Christian story itself carries a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to evangelism, connect it to life's deepest questions, and then give a lot of space for the objections and respond to that into the second part of the book. So that's a really accessible book. It's something you can either, as a Christian, gain a lot of wisdom from how to think about our faith and talk about it publicly, gives you a lot of language, or you can actually hand as a non-cringy book to put into the hands of someone who's not a believer in God and say, hey, we'd love to have a chat about this. What do you think?
So there's a whole bunch of short videos. There's also the book. So make sure people go there. You'll see in the chat, visit questioningchristianity.com. Claire, it's very keen to know where to contact you if they have further questions. Is that basically through your website? Is that best?
Yeah, if you go to the website, there's a contact button. You can find our details there. If you jump on, just find me on social media. I've got a public account on places like Facebook and Instagram. You can just send a private message and I can send you my email from there as well.
Fabulous. So what, outside of your own book, which will clearly be a great resource, and all the videos, what else do you read? What are you reading?
Oh, well, let me show you my current stack, because it's always a current bunch of things. And it's either for bits of research. And look, I think like any Christian, I'm trying to do a decent diet of stuff.
Yep.
I'm trying to do cultural analysis. I'm trying to grow deeper in my own understanding of the scriptures and God's word. I love just good scholars and things like the Bible Project, who get on a range of different voices to do their webinars. I'm a big fan of John Dixon and people he interviews through Undeceptions. But things that I'm reading is a mixture of apologetics, theology, cultural analysis, how to have better conversations with people, and then kind of the big question stuff like the hiddenness of God and suffering and evil. They're kind of constant ones where I'm trying to skill up.
So you mentioned Sam Albury. One of the other,
Yeah.
and you mentioned John Dixon, who is a friend of both yourself and us. Other authors, people that you think is, because you mentioned also Sam.
Oh wow! In this
Sean
particular
McDowell.
area, in terms of growing, I think it'd be hard to go past people like Rebecca McLaughlin,
Yes.
who's written a wonderful book, Confronting Christianity, or
Yep.
sort of 10 questions every teen should know how to answer. She's got a couple of really helpful books that are just doing that broad apologetics kind of approach. There are people that have a little bit more, I think, academic rigor in terms of their attempt to approach this, rather than doing popularizing stuff or communicating for newcomers. They're kind of people that you want to learn from. And so people like Bill Craig, people like Lydia McGrew, people like Mike Licona and Gary Habermas. There's just a whole range of New Testament scholars and historians and philosophers that are good to listen to. When I was in England, one of my favorite profs was a guy named John Lennox. He's been on our channel a bunch and has been a really dear friend and sort of grandfatherly mentor to me. Just wonderful in the science and God kind of stuff.
Yep.
And so it really is at that point trying to find the specialists. And so if you've got particular questions on, hey, here's this, can you give me someone that's useful to read on this? Just send those questions through to me and I'd be happy to oblige.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the really encouraging things about what you're saying, Dan, is that there's not a dearth of material. There's an overwhelming tsunami of material.
Yeah.
And lots of great answers. And it's just a matter of doing some research. Dan, we're wrapping this up. What's your final thought for people who are interacting with a new generation trying to find faith?
Be excited rather than apprehensive. I think the best way that we can communicate about our faith is by living it and being excited about our love for Jesus and the meaning of the gospel, and steeping ourselves in that hope and just not being afraid to share that in everyday conversations. It means that when young people are asking, they're not asking randomly out of the blue. They recognize, no, this is real in you, and they see the difference that it makes in your life personally. And so that old adage of show them about the beauty, about the relevance, about the meaning before then they're willing to open to whether it's true. I think there's a lot to that.
Fabulous. Dan, really appreciate that you've been on this webinar with us. We deeply appreciate the ministry you're doing with Questioning Christianity. We commend you and all you're doing to everybody that's on this webinar. And we're praying that God continues to use and bless your ministry. So Dan, thank you for being with us today. And thank you everybody else that's been with us. For those who've been in the chat from all over Australia, it's been fabulous to have you with us. A couple of things as we wrap up. As Dan, we asked you to do for Dan, do for us as well. Like and subscribe to Dan's YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to our YouTube YouTube channel so that you get updates about all the material that we're doing. Buy your copy of Impress for Mother's Day. Don't miss out doing that. This is a great book. It's out and about. Make sure you get your copy, Impress, and for yourself or to give it to family members. And finally, we'd appreciate your prayer. For Olive Tree Media, our team, we've just got back from the US last Friday, and we fly to the UK on Monday. And we'll be doing basically 2 weeks of interviews. And then we've got one other piece of filming in Central Australia. Make sure you watch this encounter when it's released, because you'll see what we've done in Central Australia. But we appreciate your prayer. God's been with us as we've sought to create this new series, and stay with us as we do that over our time in the UK and praying for our team. And then we get into the editing process. It won't be out till late this year, but we're getting close. So appreciate Ainsley in the background, as well as our good friend Stu Harris, who helps us out with these. Mia as well does technical support. That's all the credits. God bless. Go well.